Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we'll be discussing why Muslims are perceived in the media as terrorists. Joining us is Sharif Nashashibi, an analyst and journalist on Arab affairs. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I would like to start off with, what does terrorism mean? How can we define it?
Well, this is a big question. It has been a really prominent issue since at least the early 90s. And we're still lacking a internationally accepted definition of terrorism. And I think this is really hindering the fight against terrorism because people can't agree on what terrorism is. And every country is waging its own war on terror according to its own terms and definitions. So it really dilutes the very meaning of terrorism and hinders any fight of terrorism.
Do you think the police in the UK, when searching or investigating terrorist acts, would mainly focus on a certain group?
Yes, I mean certainly, not just in the UK, in the US and other countries in the West, it is largely Muslims that are racially profiled for these things, and this has caused a lot of grievances within the local communities. And I think it backfires because at the same time they do that, they ask the community to cooperate with the authorities to inform on people who might be extremists. But when a community as a whole is racially profiled, there won't be that cooperation. There's no trust between them and the authorities. So it's a contradictory policy that I don't think works.
Do you think religion is to blame, though, for terrorism?
No, any form of terrorism that is done in the name of religion is usually a warped interpretation of that religion. And if you look, I mean, for example, the irony is that a lot of terrorist acts committed, for example, by Islamist groups, the biggest number of their victims are Muslims as well. And this is the case in many regions around the world. So they say it's done in the name of religion, but this is not what not just Islam, but what other religions preach. It's not these kind of acts. So they are really an affront to the religion, and they tar the entire population of that religion negatively by making other people associate, say, Islam with these kind of terrorist acts.
Who do you think would actually benefit from calling the Muslims as terrorists?
It's a complicated issue because when the Soviet Union fell, it was very convenient. You know, the US had used the Soviet Union as the bogeyman, you know, to justify its policies and actions. When they fell, Islam became the replacement of the Soviet Union as the big worldwide threat. But now it's become a much more complicated issue because, you know, you have obviously stereotypes of Muslims being terrorists, but then you have a very real problem in the Muslim world that there are many conflicts in the Muslim world that are creating terrorist groups and terrorist acts, largely killing Muslims. So again, even when this is the case, the West loves to portray terrorism as primarily a problem for the West, when it is actually Muslims are the biggest victims of organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab and these organizations. So it's a very complicated issue now.
How can the Muslim countries actually help the Muslims that are actually the victims?
The problem is in Muslim countries, a lot of these conflicts that are taking place, you have militant organizations and dictatorships. And these militant organizations thrive in countries and societies where there are grievances because there are dictatorships, when human rights are violated, when freedom of expression is curtailed, things like that. That's when these organizations can thrive. So I think it's not just an issue of tackling those militant groups, it's an issue of fundamentally reforming these countries and these societies and governments. So if people can actually express their wills peacefully and democratically, then I don't think these organizations would have any basis to get support from the population.
Why is it when we hear about a terrorist act, straight away we would think that it was Ahmed, Muhammad, or a different Muslim name, and we wouldn't think it's a Michael or Nathan?
This is true. I mean, you know, Timothy McVeigh in America, when he did that bombing in America, everyone immediately thought it was a Muslim. And obviously when things like that happen, Muslims, you know, they just pray like, please don't be a Muslim, you know. And this is a real problem, that the immediate suspicion is that it's a Muslim that committed an act. But you know, unfortunately, as I said, we have a problem where there are many conflicts in the Muslim world that are creating conditions whereby, you know, terrorist acts are committed by people who claim to act in the name of Islam. And this is as much more of a problem for the Muslim community to tackle than it is for the West. So it's a problem of stereotypes, but also to a certain extent of reality on the ground.
You mentioned that there is conflict between, the Muslim countries. What is that exactly that's creating the terrorist groups?
Well, in a lot of cases, and this is not just specifically to do with the Muslim world, but in a lot of cases where there are governing systems that suppress religious expression, not just among dictators in the Middle East, but also, for example, in the Soviet Union. Islam in the Central Asian states was suppressed. Christianity in Eastern Europe was suppressed. And when you have systems that suppress religious expression, when those systems collapse, then people identify themselves by religion because they weren't able to before. So you had many conservative Catholic societies rise in Eastern Europe. You had Central Asia associating their identity with Islam because they weren't able to before. So I think this is a situation now where you have dictators like secular dictators like Bashar Assad or Mubarak in Egypt, where you couldn't express yourself in a religious way, and the only way then to express dissent was in mosques, in religious places like that. So now you have a pendulum effect where you have these dictatorships on one end and you have a kind of religious extremism on the other. And I think these countries haven't had the time yet to find a middle ground where people can peacefully express their religious or secular feelings without persecution. And I think this has to be the end goal for these countries, to find that middle ground.
But then religion is all about peace. Like no religion, if it was Muslims, Jewish or Christian, would actually say that you should do terrorist acts. And it's all about peace. Why do people tend to do terrorist acts?
Well, those terrorist acts, they say they're done in the name of religion, but as you said, these religions don't call for that kind of violence. So this is a warped interpretation of that religion. And the most dangerous thing about that is that people outside of that religion then believe that that's what the religion stands for. So people in the West associate Islam with violence because these people claim to carry out these acts in the name of religion. The media reports these acts because they are violent and explosive and they grab attention. So that then the association is made, and it's very hard to shake off. I mean, now the negative stereotyping of Islam and Muslims is so ingrained in the West, and we're talking many years now, even from the early 20th century, that it's a very difficult thing to shake off. This is going to be a generational struggle to show people that Muslims doesn't equal terrorists. I think, though, we're moving in the right direction because a lot of Muslim communities in the West are relatively new, and I think as Muslims in the West become more integrated in society, people will see that they're normal people like anyone else. So I think that will not be as much of a problem in future generations.
But what other things can we do to prevent, all the Muslims to be seen as terrorists?
It has to be a dual effort. There must be outreach to non-Muslim communities to show them that we are not like that. But there also has to be an internal approach where we try and tackle extremism within our own communities for our own sake. So it's a dual struggle. The problem is when you have racists and Islamophobes and extremists, saying things about Muslims or Islam that are not true or acting in a way that's hostile. Suddenly the community becomes defensive and they don't want to have that internal look. So I think it's a dual approach. We must show non-Muslims that Muslims don't stand for terrorism. But we must also look among ourselves and say, look, we shouldn't stand for it because it harms us. So it's a dual approach.
But many scholars from the Sunni and the Shia sect have gone out and said, for example, as ISIS is the biggest group now that's killing many people, said that they're not part of us. However, the media still calls them as Muslim and would refer to them as mainly Sunni sect. Why do you think that is?
The problem with the media generally is they love things that explode, they love violence, they love death. Not that they love it, but it sells. It sells. And frankly speaking, ISIS beheading people from different communities is more, in terms of news, it is more outrageous. It will attract more viewers than scholars saying, guys, we're all together, we're all peaceful, this is bad. That, good news doesn't sell like bad news does, unfortunately. So in any conflict around the world, it's the violent aspects of conflict that are given priority, unfortunately. So that's what people associate these conflicts with. And, scholars getting together and showing unity just isn't, from a news point of view, it's just not as sexy. It doesn't sell like bad news does. So that's a fundamental problem of the media. But again, with the media, we have to also realize the media is a business like any other. They have to sell. They have customers, they have to sell news. That's the kind of news that sells.
Can you tell us who ISIS are?
It's very difficult because ISIS, they seem, I mean, their expansion in Iraq and Syria has come very rapidly. A lot of people were completely taken by surprise by it. There are lots of different allegations of who is behind ISIS, how it was formed, who is funding it. And because of all these different contradictory allegations, it's very difficult to get to the bottom of who they are and who funds them and how they have spread so rapidly. And this is quite dangerous because of all these different allegations. It's hard. If we had a single agreed on narrative on who funds them and how they're spreading and how they're so successful militarily, it would be easier to tackle them. But you have rumors from either they were created by Israel or the US or Bashar Assad or the Iraqis. Everyone seems to have been involved in their creation, but there are so many different narratives. I think there really has to be an effort to try and understand the movement. As horrendous as the movement is, understanding it is going to have to be the key to tackling it.
Why do you think British Muslims are attracted to ISIS?
I don't think it can necessarily be assumed that ideology is the only reason why they join organizations like ISIS. I mean, there was a survey about foreign fighters in Syria, for example, and why they join these groups. And ideology was only one reason. There were the other reasons given, such as images of suffering of civilians, or wanting to go there and make a difference. There were lots of different reasons, one of which was ideology. I think that probably with ISIS, the issue of ideology is probably greater because they are so extremist that I can't imagine someone wanting to join ISIS who didn't share that ideology. But I think there's also an element of adventurism. I mean, there have been many stories of British Muslims going to fight in Iraq or Syria and realizing that it's really not what they expected or wanted it to be. I'm not sure what they want it to be, but they think they're going to go there in this kind of Wild West environment and make a difference, and then they realize it's something completely different. So I think there's many reasons, but certainly with ISIS in particular, one has to be very wary that it would be people who share that extremist ideology, given that their acts are so well documented now. I mean, it beheads people left, right, and center. It crucifies people. It executes them. All these acts. I would find it very hard to believe that one would join unless they actually agreed with that kind of behavior, which is really very shocking.
Some people are actually agreeing not with the behavior, but with the whole idea of there's a Khalifa today. What do you think about that? Like, even people in Britain who have integrated and everything, they're actually saying that it's good that there's a Khalifa in Iraq.
Well, this is very misguided because, I mean, look at what this Khalifa is doing. It is oppressing the people under its rule in a way that even Al-Qaeda has come out and said, that this is a stretch too far. So we have a real problem here when there is an organization that makes Al-Qaeda look friendly. This is a real problem. So I don't see how, even if you support the idea of a Khalifa, how you can support this Khalifa in practice, because it goes against every fundamental principle that this idea of a Khalifa is supposed to stand for. It shouldn't be based on oppressing Muslims. If this is really a state for Muslims, look at the way they're treating Muslims. It doesn't make any sense.
How can we actually remove the ISIS group?
It's very difficult because there are several forces fighting ISIS at the moment who are not necessarily aligned with each other. I mean, at the moment you have, for example, the Assad regime is now fighting ISIS. The Syrian opposition groups have been fighting ISIS for much longer, but they will never cooperate with each other. There has been talk that maybe the West should align with the Assad regime to fight ISIS commonly, but many in the West are saying no, that's not going to happen. You have the Kurds getting involved. There's the whole issue of Turkish wariness of Kurdish intentions. Iran. There are so many different actors. Saudi Arabia. None of these. This is not an alliance of people. These are countries and organizations with different agendas who happen to view ISIS as an enemy. So there's no common approach. And I don't think there will be. I think the issues dividing them are too big. But ISIS is playing on these divisions in Iraq and in Syria and among the foreign players backing each side. They're playing on these divisions to expand.
Recently, ISIS said it's going to be attacking Arafah when everyone's going to be going to Hajj. Do you think Saudi Arabia is going to do anything?
Well, Saudi Arabia already has been bolstering its border because there have been threats against Saudi Arabia before this specific threat. So they have been bolstering the border. I mean, all the neighboring countries, Jordan, Lebanon, they're all facing this threat and they're bolstering the border. I think in this particular situation, security will be very high because an incident like that, if there was to be an attack by ISIS, this would be a monumental incident and this would make headlines around the world. That's not something Saudi Arabia would want. So on top of the preparations and measures it's already implemented, I think there will be very, very heightened measures to make sure that doesn't happen.
ISIS have a plan to go to many other countries, and one of them is Jordan, and then towards the end, finish all the Arabian countries and then go into Israel. Do you think they would be successful with that?
Well, firstly, I personally have not come across any specific threat by ISIS against Israel. The threats have so far have been, again, against Muslim countries. Israel hasn't featured in it whatsoever. I'm not sure how much further ISIS can expand because, one thing, it is fighting so many different forces at the moment who are now getting more and more arms from the West, for example, and from other parts of the world. So I don't see how it can keep expanding and not experience overreach. You know, with any empire that expands too fast, it's not sustainable. And then also, I think eventually it's going to go the same way that Al-Qaeda did in Iraq, where in Iraq, Al-Qaeda, after the invasion of the US invasion, it was basically almost handed Iraq on a plate by George Bush. And they systematically treated Iraqis so badly that it was the Iraqis that rose up. And that was the beginning of the end of Al-Qaeda in Iraq as the force it used to be. ISIS is making exactly the same mistake in Syria and Iraq. It is treating people under its rule so badly that they will rise up. There are already, I mean, just last week or the week before, Sunni tribes in Iraq, had press conference saying that they are prepared to work with the government in Iraq to fight ISIS. And this was originally the support base. The Sunni community was the support base of ISIS. So it is already undercutting its own support base because of its horrendous tactics. So I don't think this Islamic State or the Caliphate, I don't think it has any serious longevity because it is fighting too many people. It's treating the people under its rule too badly. And I think it's going to go the way of other similar organizations in the region like Al-Shabaab in Somalia or Al-Qaeda in Iraq or Ansar ad-Din in Mali. They've done exactly the same mistakes and ISIS is repeating them.
You mentioned that the Sunni tribe are going to be going with the government, the Iraqi government. Do you think that's the only way forward? Because hopefully we're going to try and find many ways to help the civilians. But if the Sunnis and Shia unite, is that one of the big steps that we can take to remove ISIS?
I think Sunni and Shia unity in Iraq facing ISIS would be the single most effective way to tackle ISIS, because if it was just down to Sunni tribes to rise up, I mean, ISIS now, it is such a feared organization. I mean, it would be met with such brutality, an uprising, that there would have to be a unified approach in Iraq to fighting ISIS. As I said, at the moment you have many different forces fighting them independently. And without a common approach, that's not going to work. So there has to be a level of unity. And I think the stepping down of Maliki was a big opportunity because he was really a hated figure among Iraqi Sunnis. So now with him stepping down, there is a hope that there is a possibility of cooperation. And as I said, the Sunni tribes, not all of them, but some of them have said they're willing to work with the government. So now I think it depends on how sincere the government is going to be in meeting Sunni demands in terms of integration into security forces, offering jobs, economic opportunity, things like that. Not just how sincere they are, but how able they are. It's very difficult. I mean, one of the demands, for example, is jobs. But unemployment is quite high in Iraq anyway, so I don't think some of these demands are not easy to meet, even if the government wanted to. So I think now that we are headed into a period where there will be a wait-and-see approach, whether the government can satisfy these demands sufficiently.
But these demands you're talking about, isn't it more important first that they remove ISIS, as they're actually killing and beheading more Sunnis than Shia at the moment?
The difficulty is when these Sunni tribes rose up against Al-Qaeda, they were promised things that never happened. And this is what enabled the spread of ISIS. I mean, ISIS is part of a coalition among other Sunni forces that actually have nothing ideologically in common with ISIS. I mean, you have, for instance, Ba'athists from the Saddam regime fighting as well. They're ideologically at the opposite end of the spectrum. But there was the issue that Maliki had so disenfranchised the Sunni community that they were able to make very unlikely alliances. So I think there is the apprehension that, well, we rose up against Al-Qaeda, nothing happened, we didn't get what was promised, so why should we now? So I think this is the dangerous thing, that now there has to be a real effort to say, look, whatever happened in the past happened, but we are willing to turn a new chapter and really sit down and meet you halfway with these demands and get together. I don't think it's going to be an issue that will rise up first and then talk later. I don't think that's going to happen.
You mentioned one of the demands is jobs. Do you think the government can be able to help a lot of people with the jobs?
It's very difficult. The economic situation in Iraq is not easy. And it's not just Sunnis who want employment opportunities. So, as much as it's a valid, demand to want job opportunities, it's not something that the government can click their fingers and suddenly create more jobs. But in terms of integration within security forces, again, it should happen. But given sectarian tensions in Iraq, that's not a very easy thing to do. You have Sunni militias, you have Shia militias that have fought each other. So again, I think the list of Sunni demands are reasonable, but because the situation in the country is so tense and so complicated, they're not easy to implement. So it's going to be an issue of whether there's enough trust, whether the Sunni tribes can trust the government, whether the government trusts the tribes to work together. And if they can't, then ISIS will continue to thrive within that division.
Many people say until today, like when going to Iraq, people say that the Sunnis are our brothers, the Shia are our sisters, and they're all together in a way. But then when coming back to the UK, you see all these headlines of sectarianism, and most of the Western government mainly talk about Iraq being sectarianist. Is that the case, though?
I think there's two issues here. There's one that, as I said, sectarian attacks in terms of media coverage will get much more coverage than nice statements about cooperation, because bad news sells. The other issue, though, is that it can take one sectarian act of terrorism or violence to create a lot of sectarian tension. So while the vast majority of Sunnis and Shias might want unity, it can take one incident. You blow up a Shia mosque or a Sunni mosque or a market, and then it can unravel very quickly. And unfortunately, whether people like to believe it or not, in Iraq, in Syria, in other countries, there are people who are willing to kill other people simply for their religion or their sect. So there is an element of sectarianism. How much of an element it is in these conflicts obviously is open to debate. But I think it's wishful thinking. I think people don't want to believe that there is sectarianism. But unfortunately, yes, people are willing to kill other people simply for their sect.
Why though? What do they benefit from killing them?
Because at the moment these countries are engaged in communal struggles, and they see any attack against another community as a way of bolstering their own community. It's a really misguided way of thinking, because ultimately, if you're looking at a territorial entity, if you have all these communities at each other's throats, that will be a failed country. And I think this is why now we are seeing, to an extent, a redrawing of borders, because a lot of people have started to give up on the idea of established countries now as territorial units, because they see them as failed states. So this is the danger of sectarianism, that it's disintegrating the territorial integrity of countries in the region.
Do you think the West would actually benefit from a lot of sectarianism in Muslim countries?
I think some people in the West may see a benefit in terms of a divide and rule approach, which is this has always been the way of any colonial or occupying power or imperialist power. That if a region or a country is divided, you can benefit by playing one against the other, and makes it easier for you to advance your goals. But I think ultimately, if the region as a whole is unstable, this will be a headache not just for the region but for the entire world. If you look simply, let's say, at self-serving issues like energy supplies, it's much easier to have stable supplies if the region is stable. So I think it would be very misguided for the West to say, well, it's good if they're fighting each other, but then it'll be harder for the West to trade with them, to deal with the region. So ultimately, it's in everyone's benefit to have a unified region. But the goal of imperialists and occupying powers and colonialists is to thrive on this kind of division. So this is really a struggle going on between these two different ideologies.
Because the division that you're speaking of, we actually do see it in the UK. Like many people, if they were Muslim or not Muslim, would ask other Muslims what sect they're actually from, so they kind of can understand, the person's perspective. Why do you think it's right for people to ask the other if they're Sunni or Shia?
I don't think it's right at all. And for instance, I pride myself on, I have many Iraqi friends, Lebanese friends, Syrian friends. I don't know what any of them are, and I don't care. It's not important. What makes me really happy is sometimes I see non-Muslims or non-Arabs, ask Muslims, Arabs, what sect are you? And the answer is, does it matter? And this is what the answer should be, because it doesn't matter. And so I think this has to be the approach: is that sect doesn't matter, and anyone who's curious about it should just put it aside, because then that's how division grows. So yeah, sect shouldn't matter.
But sadly, like in the governments, we always have that if a Sunni government was in power, the Shia people may rise against it, and the opposite, when the Shia are in power, the Sunnis would go against it. So that sectarianism tension, as you mentioned, does kind of exist. How can scholars kind of remove that type of tension?
It's very hard, because a lot of these tensions are based on colonial rule, British rule, French rule in the region. They played off on purpose. They played off different sects and groups against each other for the colonialists' benefit. And so this is really a legacy of that. And in Iraq specifically, exacerbated hugely by the US invasion. This is very difficult to deal with, because you're talking about decades and decades of systems whereby one sect was given preferential treatment over another. And now the problem with, for instance, introducing democracy, while I believe in democracy being a much better system than a dictatorship, it's very difficult in countries where communities identify themselves by sect, that where they see a democratic process as a threat to their community. That's not an easy one to answer. This is going to take a very long time. I think people who point to the failings of the Arab Spring, for instance, I think they were fairly naive in thinking that suddenly in a few years the region was going to be all bright and rosy. You're talking about the reforming of whole countries and societies, that they've been under dictatorship for all this time, and now they have to find a democratic voice. That's not going to be easy until people stop viewing themselves through sect, and hence viewing democracy as a threat. They were going to continue with this problem. It's not an easy one to solve, because if you look at established democracies in the West, sect isn't an issue. In the US and Britain, there's no such thing as sect, and that makes it very easy for them to have a harmonious democracy. So while I think democracy is necessary, it's a very, very difficult thing to establish successfully in the region. It's going to take a very long time.
As you mentioned, because of sects, democracy is very hard. Do you think the only way is dictatorship for Arabian and Muslim countries?
I cannot subscribe to this belief that Arabs or Muslims are not ready or are inherently incapable of democracy, because it is almost like saying that we are a backward people that can't handle a system of free expression. I think the problem is that we have not, for so long, we have not been allowed to practice those principles, that it's going to take a long time to find our voice. Opposition groups were not tolerated in these countries for many decades. So suddenly people have to organize, they have to express their ideas about their nation, about their ideologies. This have to come out of nothing almost, because it wasn't allowed. So this is going to take time. But to say that people in the region, that all they're good for is to be trodden down on by a dictator who rules at his own will, to me, it's a grotesque way of thinking. We are better than that. We're capable of better than that. And what I find very upsetting now is people resign themselves to this idea that Arabs and Muslims have to resign themselves to either being ruled by a dictatorship or by religious extremists. Surely we should not rely on just these two options. There must be a middle ground. But this is going to take time. There has to be a level of moderation, of people finding their expressions peacefully, of reconciling the different ideologies for where they want their country headed. It's a long process, but surely we are better than putting up with dictators and religious extremists.
It is a long process. However, just like the situation in Iraq, it was for many years we had the dictator, and then when the government came into power, many people were saying, many people were against the government, and then voting came in and elections came in. Maliki got voted. However, then after a few years, he was forced to come down. And other than that, the people are never satisfied with what's going on. I'm not praising the Maliki in any way, but with the situation in Iraq, many people were actually, the security wasn't very good because, you've got Al-Qaeda and you've got other groups that were kind of, ruining everything. And, the period that they had wasn't very long. Do you think people would actually wait for the democracy to happen, or they would keep wanting change?
Well, I think in cases like Iraq and Lebanon, where there is a democratic system based on sectarianism, this is fundamentally flawed democracy. If you have a system where a prime minister or a president or a parliament speaker is voted in just because he is from a certain sect, that's not really democratic. And this entrenches the idea of sectarianism in countries like Iraq and Lebanon. So unless that changes, I don't think we're going to see any real progress. And I think there is also, people need to realize also that leaders can be democratically elected but rule dictatorially. And I think in the case of Maliki, this is what happened. He was elected, but he disenfranchised the Sunni community to such an extent that even very major elements of the Shia community were saying that he has to go, and that's when he went. He was very belligerent until Sistani and Iran and other countries, other players were saying, "Look, you have to go." It was too focused on consolidating his own power. So there's the issue of democracy shouldn't be based on sect, and if you are democratically elected, it doesn't give you free rein to consolidate your own power as an autocrat.
But do you think the situation in Iraq would actually differ, that Maliki has gone down? Is there any way that the new Prime Minister is going to be changing anything?
It's hard to tell at this point. I mean, the skeptics are saying, well, he's from the same party, so how different can he be? If there are changes, maybe it will be in style rather than substance. That's what the critics say. But I think so far it was very positive that pretty much immediately after Maliki stepped down, that these Sunni tribes had these press conferences and said, look, we're willing to work with the government, these are our demands. So there was no delay in at least a process being outlined. Now whether they go down this process, whether it succeeds, that's a different matter. It's very early days yet, but the momentum was there from the beginning. That is cause for hope.
With the situation in Iraq, with ISIS expanding, what more can the government do?
I think, at the moment, there has to be attempts to an extent to work, instead of all these different forces working independently against them, there has to be a level of cooperation. That's much easier said than done. There are certain elements that will never cooperate, such as the Syrian regime and the Syrian opposition. So that's out of the question. But for example, in Iraq, you have the Baghdad government and the Kurds fighting ISIS. But there are also a lot of tensions between the government and the Kurds, for instance, over unilateral oil sales, over the upcoming referendum, the independence referendum. So there is a level of cooperation, but a level of mistrust and tension, which again, ISIS is playing on. So there has to be, where possible, there has to be a greater level of cooperation between these different forces. But I think in terms of spreading in Iraq, the scope for ISIS is limited, because initially it said that it would march on Baghdad and predominantly Shia cities. I don't think it would be able to do that, because once they threatened those areas, you had very powerful Shia leaders in Iraq standing up and saying that's not going to happen, and like Muqtada Sadr and these leaders. I don't think ISIS would be able to take them on. So it has scope to extend within Sunni areas to an extent, but to go further south, I just don't think it would face so much resistance and would face much greater Iranian involvement then. That I don't know if it realizes yet, but as I said, its scope for expansion is limited. I mean, it's not going to, I don't think it's going to take on the Turkish army. It doesn't want to take on the Iranian army full on. It's not even threatening the Israeli army. It's not, so these are surrounding states. So it may extend a little further. I can't see how much further it can extend without triggering these very major forces that would defeat it.
How come ISIS was wanted in Syria and wasn't seen as a big threat, but when they went into Iraq, they were, like the US and other countries, felt that they had to actually remove them?
Well, the tragedy in Syria was that, I mean, ISIS were a growing threat in Syria before this very sudden and big expansion in Iraq. And the Syrian opposition groups had been saying for a long time that there needs to be a stand against ISIS. And in fact, the opposition groups had been fighting ISIS since the beginning of this year. There has been all-out war between the Syrian opposition groups and ISIS. And many thousands of people have been killed in this process. But no one seemed to be really paying attention and saying, look, we have to help the moderate Syrian opposition fight fight ISIS. And until very recently, until the big spread in Iraq and in Syria, there was the fighting between the Assad regime and ISIS was inconspicuously absent. So I think that people really dropped the ball on Syria. They allowed ISIS to continue their by not helping the opposition, the moderate opposition. The thinking was that if we help the moderate opposition, then let's say weapons might fall into the hands of people like ISIS. Well, so they didn't help the moderate opposition, and that's exactly what happened. ISIS grew out of this vacuum that its main opponents in Syria were not given the means to fight ISIS. And this is the situation we have now. I think the spread of ISIS in Iraq and Syria are not one and the same issue. I mean, I think there are different reasons why it is expanding in both countries. But yeah, I think people were too unwilling to really face the reality on the ground. And this is the situation we have now, is a much more powerful ISIS. An ISIS now that has oil fields, that has raided central banks. It now has almost a semblance of a self-sustaining economy, which that's the most dangerous thing, is that it may have initially been funded by a lot of private donors and others, but now it has an economy that other countries in the region and beyond are trading with, and that's the big problem.
With the economy that it has, do you think that they would actually be able to be defeated?
It makes it much harder now. When they took over Mosul, they raided the central bank, hundreds of millions of dollars, which helped a lot. They've taken over oil fields in Syria, which apparently the Assad regime is buying oil from ISIS now. So these are very major assets that have enabled its spread. And yet, on the other hand, you have in Syria, for example, opposition groups fighting ISIS who are not getting anywhere near the level of support they need to take on ISIS. And as I said, in Iraq, Iraq and Syria, you have a very fractured society which distrust each other, and ISIS is feeding off that. So now that it has these self-funding assets, this is the most critical phase in terms of ISIS's longevity. Is whether the forces fighting it can remove those assets from ISIS and stop it from expanding any further militarily. I think in terms of hearts and minds, it is losing that battle on its own very fast. But in terms of its ability to buy military weapons, hardware, things like that, it's these assets that are helping it expand so much.
You mentioned before, though, that the media focuses mainly on bad news. The situation in Syria was very bad. However, it wasn't really focused on like ISIS is focused on in Iraq today. Why do you think that is?
I think, with Syria, there has been an element of fatigue. I think the conflict has been going on for more than 3 years now. And I think audiences get tired of a conflict that lasts for a long time. Look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. No one pays attention unless rockets are fired from Gaza, unless something happens. People get tired and they don't want to pay attention anymore. And on top of that, the media, unfortunately, seems to be a one crisis machine. The whole world will focus on one conflict for a while, then something else happens and everyone turns to that conflict. And unfortunately, in the Middle East, there are so many flashpoints that they focus on one flashpoint, and then people forget that there are very many other just as serious flashpoints surrounding it that don't get covered. So I think Syria captured the headlines for a long time. And then once ISIS burst out into Iraq, everyone shifted to Iraq and focused on there. But I think the other issue as well in Syria is that until the great expansion in Iraq, ISIS was not expanding in Syria to the extent that it is now. I think it's captured assets in Iraq, like military hardware from the Iraqi army, taking money from the central bank in Mosul. It helped it expand its operations in Syria. Whereas before there were gains being made by the Syrian opposition against ISIS in the east of Syria. So I think its expansion in Iraq helped it expand in Syria.
Do you think we should just give them estates and let the terrorists live in just one place?
Absolutely not, because the problem is as it expands, it is getting more and more people under its authority, and it is treating everyone horrendously. I think there is a misconception that ISIS is simply targeting minorities, but that's not the case. I mean, you know, it's not just non-Muslims that are being targeted. It's Muslims, it's Sunni Muslims who they claim to be representing. They are treating everyone badly. And I don't think the region or the world should or can allow them to continue treating people in that way. If they do, there is the potential for further expansion and further destabilization in the region. So I think, you know, the West constantly talks about the need to tackle ISIS because it's a threat to the West. I don't see a threat to the West. This, not yet anyway. This is a threat to the region, and I think it is inherent on people in the region to realize that, and they do. And I think for the world to realize that unless ISIS is stopped, it's going to expand and expand. Not because people are flocking to its ideology, but because it has the means to expand militarily, to treat people terribly. I don't think it should be allowed to be stopped, but it shouldn't be allowed to expand. But importantly, in tackling ISIS, we have to be careful to do it in a way that doesn't exacerbate tensions. Because, you know, for example, now you have a lot of foreign involvement in Iraq now in terms of trying to tackle ISIS. But there could be blowback, for example. You know, there are lots of arms now going to the Kurds in Iraq, who may use them if they vote for independence in a referendum. They may use them to bolster their state. You have suspicions, for example, among Iraqi Sunnis that there are Shia militias and Iranian involvement in Iraq, so that's creating tensions. There is a lot of suspicion about American involvement, given the invasion of Iraq. So you have a situation where there are different parties involved in countries that are very suspicious of foreign involvement, and rightly so. And that could make things worse. So while ISIS must be stopped, there must be some real thought about how to stop it in a way that doesn't make things worse and that deals with the grievances that allowed ISIS to expand. The grievances among, say, the Sunni population in Iraq, or the situation in Syria that allowed it to expand. So it's not just an idea of stopping ISIS, it's stopping the grievances that helped it and making sure that any foreign involvement is done in a way that doesn't exacerbate the internal tensions that exist.
There are many Islamic states around the world. Why do people feel they need to create it themselves? Like, you know, ISIS, they've kind of done it in Syria and Iraq, and you've got people even in the UK, in London. They want London, the UK, to be an Islamic state. Why do you think that is?
You know, I'm always puzzled by people, for instance, as you mentioned, in the UK, who want there to be a caliphate in the UK. Firstly, it's a preposterous idea because the UK is, I mean, it is the vast majority of the UK is not Muslim. So how they think that the UK is going to be a caliphate? How would they do that? Are they going to suppress the 98 or so % of the population who are not Muslim? It's crazy, and frankly, it's dangerous because it's these kind of sentiments that make the news headlines here, and then people here view the whole community as some kind of a fifth column or a threat within the UK. So this is really dangerous. I think that this is, for the Muslim community must really face this problem head on, because the biggest threat to the community is people from within the community who say, yeah, we want to make Britain or the US or other countries, you know, an Islamic state. It's simply not workable, especially in this day and age where now we are looking at a caliphate that exists now in the Middle East, and you see how they're treating the people under its rule. There is no way that this is workable. And I think another avenue that may help the situation in the Middle East is that Muslims in the West must, some Muslims I come across, they tend to see issues of Iraq or Palestine or Syria as Muslim issues, and I think this is problematic. People, Muslim communities in the West have to show Westerners that these are human rights issues. They are not Muslim issues, because then that alienates non-Muslims. There are many non-Muslims who are interested in human rights in the region, but they shouldn't be sidelined by saying, no, only Muslims should be interested because this is a Muslim issue. So people must come out and say these are human rights issues. That brings in everyone. Everyone who is concerned by human rights violations will then be involved. So that, you know, tackle extremism within the community and reach out to other communities and say, look, this is a concern for all of us. We have to work together.
But why wouldn't the people that want the Islamic State just go to Islamic countries? Because there's more than one around the world.
Well, again, this is a very common question that's asked. That you know, for instance, people here who say, "Oh, we want a caliphate, we love a caliphate," and other people say, "Well, then go to the caliphate." I think that there is an irony here, is that a lot of the people in the West who call for these kind of states or these ideologies would not live under those conditions. So I think they find it very comfortable to live here say in a country like the UK, where our rights are respected as citizens, not just as Muslims or non-Muslims. As citizens, they are respected. It's easy for them to call for these ideologies. I think they would find it very difficult living over there and not being able to speak your mind, and you know, being potentially killed for the slightest of infractions that you might not even be aware of, because people interpret religion in such a varied and warped way. I think that there's a reason they don't live there is because they wouldn't live there. They call for it from outside, but they wouldn't live there.
They call for a Khalifa. However, when we actually look at, you know, the UK, for example, there are many scholars which are kind of doing what a Khalifa used to do back in the day. Do they actually need a Khalifa, like one guy that everybody follows?
I don't think so. I don't think it's practical. You know, Islam, it's such a widespread religion around the world that, and among any religions, Christianity or Islam, which has spread worldwide, it takes on slightly different forms in different regions. You know, it adapts according to local populations, to customs, to areas. It's not a very hard monolithic religion. It adapts like Christianity has around the world. So I don't think it's practical to have one authority that will speak for everyone. I think Islam in Europe has to adapt a certain way in Europe. Islam in Africa, in South America, in Asia, it has to adapt. So I think they should find their own way. I think that's the only thing that's going to happen. But also, I mean, if you raise the issue of why don't Muslims here, if they want the caliphate, why don't they go live there? We're ignoring the fact too that caliphate was built on the suffering and displacement of populations. That's their areas. Why should British Muslims, why should, say, Syrians or Iraqis welcome British Muslims into an area where they've lived for centuries? To them, British Muslims, they're foreigners. Why should they come and tell them how to live? I don't think it's a workable solution to say, well, there's a caliphate, anyone who wants a caliphate should go live there. Because, well, what about the local population who are being killed, who are being displaced? That's their land, that's their custom. Why should they expect to welcome all these foreigners who view them as you know, heathens or infidels or people worthy of being slaughtered? That shouldn't be the case at all.
How do you think Muslims should condemn the attacks made by terrorists?
Well, Muslims do condemn the attacks made by terrorists. This is a misconception that somehow Muslims are silent in the face of all these. You know, whenever there is an attack, say, in Britain or in the US or the West, you know, all these people start speaking up like, oh, why don't the Muslims condemn this? Well, we do condemn it. Often we're the first to condemn it, because it is, you know, we're fully aware of the backlash that we face when these, you know, lone, you know, terrorists or perpetrators commit these atrocities. It's us, that the community as a whole, that suffers the backlash. So we're often the first to condemn it. But I think where the problem is that when situations like that happen, you get elements, racist, xenophobic, Islamophobic elements in these societies that speak up. Then the community becomes defensive, and then the scope for cooperation is limited. And I think that's a problem. It's a very hard thing to solve, because often the Islamophobes, the racists, they are the first to speak up on that side. And then suddenly the Muslims say, well, you know, we shouldn't criticize our own because look, we have these people who want us all out. So I think, you know, the authorities should allow Muslim communities to deal with these internal problems in a way that they have the maneuverability to do so, without having to fend off these people who say, oh, you know, kick out all these Muslims, they should all go home, wherever home is. So there's no doubt that Muslim leaders and communities in the West do openly speak out and condemn these terrorist attacks, and are often the first to do so. Not just because we face a potential backlash for these acts, but also because, you know, if you look at the region, say the Middle East, it is primarily Muslims that face the brunt of these terrorist atrocities. So it's a natural phenomenon for Muslim leaders and communities to speak up and say, this is not done in our name, and we don't tolerate it, and we also don't want to be the victims of it. This is not Islam, and this is not what we stand for, and these people who commit these atrocities don't represent us or the religion. This is said a lot, but the countries in the West have to allow Muslims to express themselves without having to fend off expressions of racism and Islamophobia from people who just want Muslims out of the country. This is going to hinder the internal soul searching in the community that has to take place to root out these people and say, look, you are harming our community and you don't belong to us.
How can we tell our audience, which are mainly Muslims, when they are being attacked by racist Islamophobics? What should they do? How should they respond?
There are various ways you can respond, depending on the type of abuse you're facing, where you face it. For example, if you are facing discrimination in the workplace, there are legal practices and frameworks that you can use to solve your problem, whether it's directly within the company or whether it's an ombudsman outside of the company. So it really depends. Verbal attacks, physical attacks, legal frameworks, there are different things, community outreach. It's difficult to say there is one approach. It really depends how you're being harassed. But what I will say is that the information is out there. It's very easy on the internet, and with the very well organized and well established Muslim communities in this country to give you information to tell you how to deal with the specific way that you are being discriminated against or abused. So if that happens, don't be afraid to speak out. Talk to Muslim organizations, look on the internet. The information is out there. So what I will say, do not be silent. Do not be silent, because the framework exists in countries like the UK to get your rights. If you feel that you're being discriminated against, the law is there. Practices are here to make sure that that doesn't happen. So don't be silent, whatever you do.
Thank you very much for those words, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
And see you next time on Beneath the Surface.